All right, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for the responsibility to protect and Libya kill R2P. Really excited to have you all here. This event is brought to you by the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, and in particular by our Student Advisory Board, so we're very excited to host this. For those of you who are familiar with the center, or who are not, we have several events coming up this week in addition to this. Tomorrow we have an event focused on cool human rights work that you can do on your summer vacation. So if you're interested in that, there's a flyer on the front table. And then on Thursday, we are hosting another event focused on the question of, is immigration and border enforcement inherently abusive? If you're interested in that, again, flyer on the front table, and both of these will be lunch events. With no further ado, I'm going to introduce Caitlin, who will take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, providing the international community with the authority to intervene to protect the civilians of Libya. NATO's subsequent intervention in Libya is widely regarded as a watershed moment for the development of the emerging human rights norm, the responsibility to protect. While NATO's role in Libya is often considered a case of successful humanitarian intervention, questions surrounding the status of the responsibility to protect doctrine linger. What are the implications of NATO's involvement? Should R2P involve regime change? And why is Syria so different than Libya? Now, before our esteemed panelists begin their discussion of the issues emerging as a result of Libya, I would like to give a very brief introduction to the responsibility to protect doctrine, which at the 2005 World Summit, member states included in their outcome document. So the responsibility to protect is comprised of three pillars. The first pillar is that a state has a responsibility to protect its own citizens from mass atrocity crimes, which include genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. The second pillar is that the international community has a responsibility to assist states in protecting their citizens. And the third pillar is that the international community should use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to protect populations from these crimes. If a state fails to protect its populations or is in fact the perpetrator of crimes, the international community must be prepared to take stronger measures, including the collective use of force through the UN Security Council. That being said, let me turn it over to our experts who can tell you much more about the responsibility to protect doctrine than I can. Jonas Klaas, is a program assistant at the United States Institute of Peace's Center for Conflict and Analysis and Prevention, focusing on conflict prevention, the prevention of mass atrocities, and serious issues in Pakistan, security issues in Pakistan. Klaas joined the Institute in January 2009 as a research assistant for Lawrence Wucher, program officer at USIP. He holds a master's in security studies from Georgetown University, a master's in international relations from, this is another one I will butcher, the Catholic University in Leuven, Belgium. His personal research interests include the EU integration process, non-traditional transnational security challenges, transatlantic relations, and the integration of diasporas in modern societies. We also have with us today Mr. Don Kraus, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Citizens for Global Solutions, a grassroots membership organization envisioning a future in which nations work together to abolish war, protect our rights and freedoms, and solve the problems facing humanity that no nation can solve alone. Prior to working with Citizens for Global Solutions, he served as the Executive Director of the Campaign for United Nations Reform and its affiliated political action committee, CUNRPAC. Mr. Kraus currently co-chairs 3 NGO working groups, the Partnership for Effective Peacekeeping, the Washington Working Group on the International Criminal Court, and the CEDAW Task Force. He also plays a lead role in the Law of the Sea Working Group, a broad group of organizations and trade associations focused on U.S. ratification of the convention. Mr. Kraus also compiles the Global Solution Report Card, an annual assessment of congressional voting records. And finally, we have with us WCL's very own Dr. Clovis Maqsood, who is the chief representative of the League of Arab States in India from 1961 to 1966. From 1967 to 1979, he served as the senior editor of Al-Ahram and then chief editor of Al-Nahar Weekly. Ambassador Maqsood was appointed as the League of Arab States chief representative to the United States and the United Nations on September 1st, 1979. On August 15, 1990, he submitted his resignation from the League in the aftermath of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. As a lawyer, journalist, and diplomat, Dr. Maksud is the author of several articles and books on the Middle East and Global South, among them The Meaning of Non-Alignment, The Crisis of the Arab Left, Reflections on Afro-Asianism, and the Arab Image. Dr. Maksud currently is the director of the Center for Global South at American University. So please join me in welcoming them all.
Well, thank you, Caitlin, for your kind introduction. I must say it's making me a little nervous to talk about the responsibility to protect in front of law students from American universities. That usually means you get very difficult questions about the legal status of R2P. Luckily, we got Don Kraus here. International law is his turf. So any question related to that, we can direct to him. I would like to take this opportunity today to make 3 points. First, I would like to assess the status of R2P following the intervention of NATO in Libya and the current atrocities being committed in Syria. Second, I would like to discuss the selectivity of the international community in its response to mass atrocities. And third, I would like to say a few words about the ongoing efforts of the US government in order to address R2P crimes. The question in front of us today deals with the status of R2P following the international engagement in Libya. In my view, the Libyan experience may have damaged R2P's ability to enhance international efforts to prevent atrocities, at least in the short term. I think in the long term, the effect of this episode may be more positive for R2P. As you all know, and as Caitlin just mentioned, in February and March of this year, the Security Council passed Resolution 1970 and 1973 on Libya, which invoked the responsibility to protect and which resulted into what some have called the first R2P war. I won't go as far as labeling the NATO intervention a success, but the mission did achieve its objectives at a reasonable cost. The operation was certainly far from perfect. The confines of the resolution, they were stretched to its limits, and it only remains to be seen whether the next regime will be able to address the risk of future atrocities, especially as we hear that abuses against former Ghaddafi loyalists are starting to trickle in, the news about those. When assessing the operation, the NATO operation itself, I think we should always keep in mind that as soon as the use of military force is authorized in the name of R2P, that automatically means that prevention has failed. I think this is key. As a result of the operation in Libya, we see that once again R2P is being equated with the very old concept of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention, which was widely opposed in the 1990s when Bernard Kouchner put it on the table of the international agenda, is distinct from R2P in at least 2 ways. First of all, it is inherently reactive, whereas R2P emphasizes the importance of preventive action. And also humanitarian intervention emphasizes the use of military force, whereas R2P allows for a very broad array of measures, whether they are economic, legal, diplomatic, or military as well. These tools can both be used in a cooperative way and a coercive way. So how did the Libyan experience affect the status of R2P? Last month, Russia and China refused to accept another invocation of R2P at the Council, and they vetoed a rather mild resolution that would merely have condemned the Syrian authorities. These vetoes, together with the abstentions of the IPSA countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and Lebanon, present an R2P-wary backlash following the NATO intervention in Libya. And as I mentioned, this experience certainly strengthens the misperception that as soon as one invokes R2P, that it automatically allows for the use of military force. Of course, the negative vote on Syria is not only the result of what happened in Libya. The political context of both R2P cases was quite different. The Russian and Lebanese ties with the Syrian regime, they contrast with the politically isolated position of the Ghaddafi regime, and it allowed the other BRIC countries to bandwagon on the Russian opposition. The regional support for decisive action in Libya was also missing in the case of Syria, at least initially. We all know what happened over the past weekends. Perhaps these events and the growing support of the Arab League for action against Syria may facilitate the passing of a Security Council resolution that would be meaningful. In the short term, the Libyan experience certainly reduced the appeal of this principle. The emerging powers in the Security Council are now very cautious to act in the name of R2P. It was the Indian ambassador who mentioned after the vote on Syria, he said that Libya gave R2P a bad name. And now the Brazilians are raising the importance of what they call the responsibility while protecting, which is a different way of saying that before we act, we should do no harm. This reality check and apparent blow for the R2P principle following the humanitarian moment in Libya does not necessarily mean that R2P advocates are back at square one. The experience in Libya did reveal that when the situations are right, when the circumstances are right, and when other measures have failed, that the international community is in fact able and willing to use the ultimate tool, military force, to protect civilians. In the long term, R2P's normalization is likely to benefit from this episode in Libya. The centrality of R2P lingo right now in the Security Council, it indicates another step away from its traditional and ad hoc approach to prevent mass atrocities. We saw that in the discussion on Côte d'Ivoire, on Libya, and on Syria right now. International atrocity prevention, it will remain conditioned by geopolitics, but our score sheet will display high levels of inconsistency for some time to come, that is. But I think that R2P, its normative potential, it has the ability to counter this realpolitik to some extent. It can raise the cost of inaction, and it can start slowly transforming into a standard framework for international response to atrocities. But certainly, this is a very idealist perspective. Certainly, R2P has a very long way to go, and critics are right to point out that the international response is still very inconsistent. It's justified that they say, why, if we are concerned about civilian protection in Libya, why don't we see any action in Syria, in Yemen, or in Darfur? I'm personally surprised to hear this critique. At USIP, we get this question all the time, particularly if we go to developing countries. I think that though deplorable, the explanation for this inconsistency is pretty straightforward. The authorization of a robust Libya-style intervention is the product of a very long and difficult diplomatic process, usually, and subject to numerous factors that are unrelated to the gravity and urgency of the situation. First factor, of course, is the power of the target country. If you compare Russia with Libya, there's never going to be a humanitarian intervention at the same scale or at the same size in Russia because they are a Security Council member, because they have nuclear weapons, and because they have a very strong diplomatic strength in the region and at the global level. Another factor, of course, is the strategic value of the region. If you compare the interventions or lack thereof in Kosovo and Rwanda in the 90s, you can see that Kosovo, which is at the doorstep of the European Union, was strategically much more important, and it triggered a response much more quickly. The decision to act collectively against atrocities is also contingent upon the consent of a significant part of the local population, regional powers, and local, regional, and sub-regional organizations. And how about the consent of the regime itself, of course? Well, we see that there's two kinds of R2P interventions. There's interventions in countries that are unable and unwilling to protect their own population. And it's pretty clear that interventions are more likely to be welcomed if the regime is unable to halt atrocities that are committed by others, by rogue elements within the security forces, non-state actors, the opposition, etc. If a regime is directly or indirectly responsible for the crimes, then a consensual humanitarian intervention will be very unlikely. Fourth are geopolitical dynamics, special ties or strategic relations between the target country and some of the big players. often reduce the likeliness of a multilateral intervention. I think Kyrgyzstan was a good example of that, where it was a very grave situation, but because it is somewhat in still the sphere of influence of Russia, that the West was not so eager to push for strong efforts there. And finally, other factors that influence the international community's decision to engage in this intrusive form of intervention include the level of international media coverage, international financial climate, and the availability of the military resources that are necessary. So in an ideal world, all these considerations should actually be subordinate to the gravity or urgency of the situation, but they are not. Double standards, in my view, are an unpleasant reality that sprouts from the nature of international politics. So to answer the question of the title of this panel, did Libya kill R2P? I don't think it did. It experiences growing pains, R2P, but we can improve the principle while operationalizing it. And I'll just give 3 quotes that illustrate my point of view on this. First is by Ambassador Richard Williamson, who's a former U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, who used an old African saying to refer to R2P, and it says, "The path is made by walking the elephant grass." Second quote is by New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, who wrote, "Isn't it better to inconsistently save some lives than to consistently save none?" And I'll end with Kissinger, who said, "You need realism to take steps, but you need idealism to know where you're going." I think these speak for themselves. When assessing the inconsistent international response to atrocities, it's useful to categorize cases of R2P crimes in 4 different categories. First, you have the non-invocations. Those are cases where R2P is objectively taking place, but R2P is just never invoked. I think the DRC is a good example here. Second, there are inappropriate invocations. Russia invoking R2P to justify its actions against Georgia, I think, is an example. There are appropriate invocations with ineffective action. Kyrgyzstan being the example, and appropriate invocations followed by effective action. I think, although the jury's still out, Libya might end up in this category in the end. Finally, let me end by saying a few words about the ongoing U.S. efforts to enhance its capacity to address R2P crimes. Even though the acronym R2P is very rarely used in Washington, D.C., the U.S. administration is actually doing a lot to advance this agenda, but they approach it from a different angle. They do not use R2P, the acronym. They usually talk about distinct labels like genocide prevention, atrocities prevention. The prevention of mass atrocities was considered a strategic priority in the 2010 U.S. National Security Strategy, which also refers to R2P. A new position was created at the National Security Council, where David Pressman is now the Director for War Crimes and Civilian Protection. And most recently, in August, President Obama issued a presidential study directive on mass atrocities, which authorized the creation of an interagency atrocities prevention board. I think the release of these findings should come out any day now. At the U.S. Institute of Peace, we also try to contribute to U.S. capacity building to prevent atrocities. Our R2P working group, a project which we support in partnership with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Brookings Institution, it's co-chaired by Secretary Madeleine Albright and Ambassador Richard Williamson. This working group tries to analyze and address the political hurdles that still remain to implement R2P, particularly at the level of the U.S. government. We look at the NSC, White House, the role of Congress, but also delve into the role of media and public opinion in implementing R2P. I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll turn it over to Mr. Krause next.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Jonas, for giving me all the legal questions. I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV. For those of you not familiar with Citizens for Global Solutions, we're a national membership organization that strategically promotes U.S. engagement with international organizations to solve global problems. We believe international cooperation is essential to resolve global problems, to build a safer and more secure world. More information at globalsolutions.org about programs, memberships, internships, etc. No, Libya didn't kill R2P. In fact, I believe the concept is here to stay. Probably what's more on the way out is the policy of non-state intervention dealing with mass atrocities. I was fortunate to be in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates when Security Council Resolution 1973 was being debated. So I was giving a presentation on UN reform, and so I was able to talk with quite a number of Gulf state policymakers and academics. And there was this incredible support and call for establishing a no-fly zone, for really strengthening what had started on Security Council Resolution 1970 at that point. And while they really wanted to see that, there was also pretty good concurrence that they did not want to see NATO troops on the ground. They understood that it's kind of difficult to protect babies from 30,000 feet. They really didn't have a good answer on exactly how to do that, but they knew at that point military, and particularly European military and U.S. military on the ground in Libya would not be a good thing. So they were very much about, let's take this one step at a time. It seemed to be the overall assessment. We want to move forward, but let's take it one step at a time. And I think that's a pretty good characterization about how we're engaging and getting involved in the responsibility to protect. Today I really just want to touch base on really how much since 2005 on the outcome document of the UN summit, when responsibility to protect was adopted by the General Assembly by consensus, to deal with these four crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, how much it really has been a game changer in terms of how the international community is reacting to mass atrocities. A little bit more about the U.S. position regarding responsibility to protect. I want to touch base on how we really need to broaden our recognition and acknowledgement of R2P actions that happen, but we just don't call responsibility to protect. And then also, finally, a little bit more on the role of the Security Council permanent members regarding responsibility to protect. So, first off, let's just take a look about how much of a game changer this has been. What happened in Libya, it really was lightning fast when you compare it to some of the atrocities that have happened in the past. Think about it. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that war began in 1996 with all the killings, the ethnic violence, the mass rapes. It really wasn't until 2003 from 1996, it took 3 years for the UN to establish MONUC, the peacekeeping force there, and then it wasn't until 2003 that the French got involved to really try to significantly stamp down on some of the violence there. In Darfur, the crisis began in 2003, and the UN didn't create UNAMID until 2007. So there you had this really long, stretched-out period of violence before there was this significant reaction by the international community. The Libyan protest and the accompanying violence began on February 17th, and 9 days later, the UN Security Council voted on Resolution 1970 to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, establish an arms embargo, and apply the sanctions. And then less than 1 month after that, when it was clear that Ghaddafi was not going to actually comply when he said, we're going to stamp you out like rats and cockroaches, Resolution 1973 was invoked at that point. So there really has been this acceleration and this focusing of the international community about how it responds to and its responsibility to be able to prevent and then react to mass atrocities when they happen. And we talk about this here. We all have a basic understanding of responsibility to protect. I think it's also important to understand how little is known about it throughout our country. I speak in many, many parts of the country, typically to audiences that are interested in international affairs and global policy. And if I say, how many of you know who responsibility to protect is? Typically, I may get 3, 4 hands up in an audience this size that already know about it. So there's this huge education curve that needs still to happen before we could really effectively implement it. Fortunately, we've had some mentions lately on CNN, on Rachel Maddow, but still it's very early on in the process. What is encouraging is the role that the U.S. government is playing on it. not too long ago in March at the Holocaust Museum at an event honoring the late Representative Tom Blantos, Vice President Biden said, quote, "We've made the responsibility to protect the simple but novel concept that states must shield their populations from atrocity a core element of our national security strategy." He then went on to say, when a state engages in atrocity, it forfeits its sovereignty. And there's been this linkage between atrocities, responsibility, and sovereignty that has been made and really is getting traction. As you know, it's mentioned, it is reflected in our national security strategy, in the Presidential Security Directive, and so I think we'll see more and more of this. We also need to understand that there are a lot of actions that are happening regarding the responsibility to protect that we just don't use those words. I mean, if you think about it, you know, there's Pillar 1, which is a country doing what it needs to do to stop atrocities, and that happens on a regular basis and is never ever talked about in terms of responsibility to protect. Pillar 2, where the states in the region need to take some action and help that country. There, you know, if you think about it, Kenya, where there was a lot of effort from the U.S., from other states within Africa to really stop the violence there. That really was a Pillar 2, in my opinion, responsibility to protect, maybe even verging on to Pillar 3. Southern Sudan, where there was a possibility of a genocide breaking out instead of elections happening. And there, once again, NGOs, many nations within Africa, the U.S., the European countries, really all came in to try to work very, very hard, and we had elections instead of a mass atrocity. And I think what just happened with the Arab League as well is also another Pillar 2 scenario where regional nations are engaging before it gets to that Pillar 3 level. It might lead to that, but the problem is we're not, as a community of activists, of academics, of policymakers, really saying, aha, responsibility to protect is happening. So what happens is, the only time we start calling it responsibility to protect is when it gets to the point where we've already failed in terms of prevention, where the Security Council is actually engaging in this and starting to talk about interventions and sanctions and other stronger pieces. So I think if we want responsibility to protect to be successful, we need to broaden the dialogue about when it's actually being employed, so there's a better understanding of what it is. Because if it comes back down to just another word for Western humanitarian intervention, we're going to have problems keeping it successful. So I think that's part of our job as a community of civil society and others to really keep making that point. And let's, in terms of the other point I wanted to talk about just briefly is also the role of the Security Council. As was mentioned, there was this double veto by Russia and China in terms of the Syrian pretty watered down resolution. And one of the things that we're starting to talk about is going on beyond responsibility to protect, but a specific role of the Security Council permanent 5 members of a responsibility not to veto. Think about it. If you have a responsibility to protect, and you've already signed on to this as a member of the United Nations, you voted for it in the General Assembly, then if you're a permanent member of the Security Council, when it comes to situations of dealing with mass atrocities, you have a responsibility not to use your veto to protect your client states, your people that you want to be able to do business with when they are performing mass atrocities. We do not want to give P5 members a free ride to use their veto in this way. So one of the things that we've been talking about is responsibility not to veto. You know, in Syria we have a death toll over 3,500 right now, which is increasing every day. And we believe that Security Council members have a choice. They either need to agree to stop using their veto in situations dealing with mass atrocities when otherwise a majority of the Security Council would go ahead with a resolution, or they can maintain their status as controlling members of a body that becomes increasingly irrelevant. And so as we move forward, we want to be able to talk about this. It's really up to us as people interested in international law, as civil society, to be able to move forward with this and push it forward in the future. So why don't I hold out anything else for questions at this point and move on to the professor.
Well, I don't think I have much more to add. However, I think I would like to make few remarks on the Arab autumn at the time, because I think we have romanticized the revolutionary developments that have taken place, and they were inspiring, but they are facing with a great deal of complex issues and challenges. And therefore, it is important that the responsibility to protect becomes an imperative, particularly in the Arab world, but also it is a universal doctrine which needs to be reinforced by instruments of preventive diplomacy and early warning systems. So to avoid the capacity of those who are intent to suppress, destroy, kill, that there must be at the United Nations and at the level of regional organizations systems of detecting the possibilities and how to preempt the evolution of any kind of crisis which has humanitarian consequences. So in this respect, let me just comment on some of what has been said. First of all, Libya. There is no doubt that if there wasn't any intervention and the Security Council Resolution 1973, where the imperative of salvaging around 200,000 people in Benghazi, imminent attack on Benghazi, what this has shown that the only available instrument of protecting was NATO at the disposal of the United Nations Security Council. Now, first of all, this should not become a precedent to be followed. Secondly, what is the replacement? What has to take place? On the one hand, we have situations now in Yemen, we have situations in Syria, we might have situations in Palestine and other places. So how do we manage the humanitarian crisis without perceiving that it is almost, implementing it is almost the responsibility of Western powers, particularly of NATO? That is a major crisis. The responsibility to protect should be complemented with what Brian Urquhart, the first Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, proposed during his tenure, lengthy tenure, proposed after he retired, and published many of his proposals in the New York Review of Books. And to summarize them, it required that the United Nations must ask member states from different countries to earmark some of their armed services to be trained as peacekeepers and peace enforcers, and perhaps also peace builders. But that was an extension of the United for Peace, that was the extension, sorry, for the agenda for peace that Boutros Ghali was asked to develop, and furthermore, that it was elaborated during the tenure of Kofi Annan. But here is where these were conceptual schemes that probably anticipated and heightened the anticipation in the aftermath of what took place in Rwanda. It is this complementarity, namely a peacekeeping and trained peacekeepers, earmarked to be trained for peace enforcement, humanitarian intervention, etc. These were considered at the moment sort of, rather than mutually reinforcing responsibility to protect with the plan how to protect, provided the opportunity to create an instant suspicion that NATO intervened when the United Nations was incapable to have the available forces to provide the perception of objectivity and the implementation of humanitarian intervention. Now this dilemma has been justified, in my view, but it will be only justified as an exception and not as a precedent. That is the important factor. Rapid deployment should be associated with an international peacekeeping, peace enforcement measure under the jurisdiction of the United Nations Security Council and the Secretary General. It should be done because in order to gather elements to immediately intervene, not to have an immense number of casualties between the resolution by the Security Council under Chapter 7 and the implementation, you need to have them ready-made. I remember during my state in the United Nations, the Secretary General had to debate and go and plead with every single country which was willing to give, and Nepal and Jordan and others. So what we have is a delay during which time humanitarian casualties were in evidence. It is here that besides studying and applying the responsibility to protect, it is necessary that it should be reinforced by rapid deployment peacekeepers and peace enforcers under the authority of the United Nations, and you could have a predominant Western groups, but provided they have the United Nations cap in them. This is necessary. But in order to have this and to preempt humanitarian disasters and crises, it is necessary to install in the United Nations and throughout the world, under UN and under other countries too, because individual countries should have this early warning system. Early warning system, and feed the United Nations, besides its own early warning system, feed it with information to detect early enough possible emerging crisis on a humanitarian level. It is in this context that you would have preventive diplomacy functional. You will have the reinforcement of the the responsibility to protect feasible and without any kind of controversy pending its intervention on a humanitarian basis. So the lesson at this juncture of Libya is that while Gaddafi regime was extremely known for its excessive brutality, there was a mitigating justification for the NATO to come because the time frame was very quick and the threat was imminent. So on this level, it is well known that we have to have a reinforcing process in order to render the Security Council more relevant when it takes a resolution, and it should have at its disposal what the United Nations is, unbiased frameworks to intervene in crises such as Libya and perhaps now Syria and others. Now, the assessment of where to go as humanitarian intervention is a very interesting case. And the two cases of Yemen and Syria are today an instant challenge to the United Nations and to the superpowers and the veto practicing members. One, Yemen. Why is the international community reluctant to intervene? First of all, the United States in particular consider still, and perhaps rightly so, that there is a threat of terrorism by Al-Qaeda. So it is reluctant to help empower the revolution there for fear that there might be infiltration. Here is where preventive diplomacy, early warning system, and an analysis of the objective situation in Yemen, and to assess the degree or the extent of this threat of terrorism to be infiltrating. While government terrorism by Ali Abdullah Saleh is practiced on a day-to-day level. So the United States at that moment went to its allies in the Gulf countries to ask them or to inspire them, maybe not ask them, but to inspire them or to suggest to them that they should try and manage a situation where there will be a relatively transfer of power. Yet, the responsibility to protect has not yet reached the Security Council concerning Yemen, despite the 8 months or 9 months that this crisis has taken place. We go to Syria today. In Syria, what makes the reluctance of the international community to intervene on a humanitarian basis is its geopolitical location. Syria is not an easy task. One is that Syria has borders with very sensitive areas in the Middle East, with Turkey, with Iraq, with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Palestine, with Israel. And the fact that there is a reluctance to address it logically is the absence of clear knowledge about the alternative to the regime. And it is in this context that early warning systems should have been established to study and analyze and assess the possibilities that might ensue as a result of the intervention that would take place. This also is an area where conflicting international interests are so self-evident that while today China has gone through a process of perhaps abstaining if it comes to the Security Council, Russia, which has a great deal of investment in Syria, today opened up and received the opposition in Syria. Perhaps diffusing the possibility of exercising a veto, yet all these inhibiting factors, especially in the case of Syria, are there. Now, what happened in the last few days, and that is important, what happened is that the Arab League, which has always been reluctant to provoke a member state, irrespective of what it is, took a bold breakthrough and recommended, after 16th, if Syria does not respond, recommended the suspension of the state of Syria from the Arab League. And with the centrality, with the geopolitical centrality of Syria in the context of the region, that was a bold adventure on the part of the Arab League. In this respect, how do we begin to think into regulating the wedding of responsibility to protect with the necessity and the imperative necessity to make it credible and acceptable? How do we wed it with one, preventive diplomacy, which includes early warning systems on a bigger level than now. Two, to earmark, to develop a revolutionary breakthrough in the United Nations system, to earmark rapid deployment forces at the disposal of the Security Council to intervene, so that the gap between the period of intervention and the event is shortened in order to avoid casualties if the responsibility to protect is to be credible, effective, and morally enforced. So in this respect, I think that these examples necessitate for all of us to begin to think in terms of practical breakthroughs in reforming the UN system, because humanitarian interventions in a globalized world, we find that globalization is taking place at the same time simultaneously with fragmentation. And that is the challenge in the next, at least next decade, that I anticipate. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So I'd like to allow you guys a chance to respond if you have anything you'd like to add, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I think I would like to start by echoing what Don said about R2P being a label and the importance to use that label appropriately. As he mentioned, R2P is now frequently used in reaction to humanitarian intervention, Security Council action. But if I would have to give one recommendation to the new joint office in New York on the prevention of genocide and the promotion of R2P, it is exactly to come up with this communication strategy of labeling consistently R2P, all the activities that are being done, which are many of them, to address the risk of mass atrocities, to label those as R2P. In a couple of months we have, I think in 2 months we have a delegation from University of Queensland, Australia, are coming over to USIP, and they're going to come present the research that has been done about regional actors like ASEAN, like the Australian government, on supporting local initiatives to address the risk of atrocities in countries that do not make it on the list of on the focus agenda here in Washington D.C. Countries like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, etc. And there have been instances there that the risk of atrocities, or they have been ongoing there, and the risk is sometimes increasing. So these are initiatives that are non-military, by strengthening the legal structure, making sure that the rights of minorities are respected, etc. A lot has been going on, and I think if we start labeling those activities as R2P operations, I think it will certainly shift the attention away from the military component, which is indispensable for the future of R2P as a framework. I also would like to make a brief comment about R2P as a game changer following Libya. I agree completely with the significance of R2P's invocation in that resolution, but I would also like to put things into perspective. These are things that are often done very pragmatically. I think it was pretty clear that in the first draft resolutions to Libya, there was no mentioning of R2P at all. The first draft that was proposed included POC language, protection of civilians, which is similar but related but distinct concept, which is dealt with at Security Council. R2P is dealt with more at the General Assembly. And this draft, which was proposed, it was put off the table. And in the second draft, R2P language was included. And I was surprised to hear that that one did pass, because I was always under the impression R2P was more controversial than POC. So it sometimes depends on small little details. The conditions were all right for R2P in advance of Libya. So I think we can definitely label it as a game changer, a significant moment. And finally, a word on the early warning systems. I think it is crucial. It comes at the very, very beginning of the prevention phase. But of course, the efforts to build an early warning system within the UN is a long-standing effort, which has never really materialized. I think the latest step that has been taken is that new joint office that I mentioned on prevention of genocide and promotion of R2P. This joint office has the mandate to provide early warning directly to the SG, which then can bring the issue in front of the Security Council. We still have to see what the significance of this new joint office will be, but as always, I'm hopeful. So,
I guess I'll briefly mention two things. Citizens for Global Solution has long supported a standing UN peacekeeping and peace enforcement capacity. We've supported a proposal for a UN emergency peace service for quite some time. I talked earlier about how I had been in Abu Dhabi when 1973 was being debated. And so when the policymakers there were in the United Arab Emirates were saying, no, we don't want NATO on the ground. So I said, well, what about the Gulf Coast states? What about you guys? And they said, well, we're a little busy right now. If you recall, Bahrain and Yemen were underway. So then I said, well, what if there was this international force with people from all over the world representing all these different nations under the command of the UN that went in? Would that be okay? And there was like, well, that might be all right. There was this feeling of that could be a reliable and responsible player to do this kind of on-the-ground intervention that can be needed in these kind of situations, which I felt was very, very helpful. The one thing that we haven't talked about, I'll just throw it out there, is also the role of nations being able to help apprehend individuals who are being sought by the International Criminal Court as part of one of the sticks that we use actually to help prevent this. It's something that really has come along quite a way, and it's kind of grown up a little bit as Responsibility Protect has grown up. And it's a piece of this puzzle that I just wanted to make sure it was on the table as discussion continues.
Well, just to add a couple of other suggestions. I'm glad that we're opening up to things that should be added. Regional organizations that are recognized by the United Nations, such as the Arab League, such as the Organization of American States, etc., they should also have the priority of intervening in an area where they have jurisdiction. And that is something that I have advocated after my resignation, though, from the Arab League. So, because I proposed at the time of invasion of Kuwait an Arab solution which included bringing peacekeeping people, deploying them to the borders without saying, Saddam saying, withdraw, redeploy, something like that. But it didn't work because there was a reluctance. I think with the escalation of humanitarian interventions and humanitarian crisis, I think regional organizations, simultaneously with the reform of having the Urquhart plan in terms of peacekeepers, etc., to have it also on the level of regional organizations, and that might be one of the capacity to reduce the feasibility of somebody wanting to veto a crisis. The Arab League has the capacity to deploy elements of its army, such as Jordanians have always been ready to do it. We can have more, so that instead of making coup d'etats, they can make peacekeeping. So this might be idealistic at this moment, but as the tragedies are becoming much more audible and visible in Syria, in Libya, the evidence there, up to a point in Yemen, all these are beginning to stimulate discussions, editorial articles, to say, and the Arab League in this last week took a position, we want to mobilize the capacities of the region in order that it doesn't, in order that they would be the first instant of intervention if it is possible. The other thing is that there is a prevailing perception that the minute you ask for protecting, responsibility to protect in Syria now, or in Yemen, the immediate response is, our revolution is internal, we want to have reforms, we want to have democracy, we don't want foreign intervention. The minute you say foreign intervention, you're beginning to challenge the responsibility to protect. In order to make responsibility to protect acceptable as a norm, then you would have to avoid what I said earlier, having NATO as a precedent rather. But you can get from NATO some peacekeepers, but within the realm of the United Nations enforcement policy.
All right, I'd like to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
I have a question about the tipping point. So, for instance, especially in regards to sovereignty, what is the tipping point when there could be a legitimate and lawful R2P intervention? But between, like, for instance, a domestic affair, which I believe the UN Charter says you're not, as an international community, allowed to get involved with internal affairs, versus it becoming an international matter. And I'm wondering, is that just tokens? How is it justified under customary international law?
All right, so the question is, what is the tipping point? Looking at legitimate responsibility to protect intervention and versus, what was the last part of?
What basically is the difference between, like, internal affairs versus international community lawful response? Is it just tokens, for instance?
I'll give you start with a non-legal answer. At its core, responsibility to protect basically says that nations are sovereign. But with sovereignty comes responsibility, and it's limited very, very clearly to just 4 specific crimes. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing is the language that has been used surrounding it. So the tipping point becomes when nations allow their populations, and notice it speaks about populations, not citizens, their populations to be subjected to these crimes, either because they don't have the capacity to be able to halt them or they are the actual perpetrators of them. So bottom line for me, the tipping point is when governments are using helicopter gunships, artillery, and tanks against protesters who simply want their voice heard. As we saw in Libya, as we see in Syria, to me, that's the tipping point. And I think it's pretty clear. We're not talking about just some riots or some domestic violence that's happening. We're talking about we're talking about systematic use of force is clearly part of this as well.
I think at this moment in history, we are beyond sovereignty. At least moving towards relative sovereignty in a way that complements your analysis, and that, however, has not been clearly described. There is a consciousness that we are in an age beyond sovereignty, that there is no more absolute sovereignty, even for major superpowers. So in a way, if we accept that we are beyond sovereignty, then the interconnectedness among states, among people, means that we can no longer accept the immunity of sovereignty, especially sovereign states that consider that they are beyond questioning. Now, of course, that's not going to happen overnight. That is where much of the amendments to the Arab League Charter, to the Charter of the United Nations, must begin to be undertaken. Because as I mentioned earlier, we are in a situation where we have globalization, where we're very intimately interconnected. We know everything about everybody. But on the other hand, this beginning of the loss of, or the erosion of individual countries' identity has led to the proliferation of identities within sovereign, well-known sovereign states. It is here that globalization and fragmentation are simultaneous processes that are taking place on the global level that is producing issues and solutions and problems beyond sovereignty. So it is in this context that we have to reinforce the notion of the responsibility to protect by empowering it empowering the doctrine with the instrumentalities which makes responsibility to protect feasible and speedy, because as you mentioned, the genocide, how much can we tolerate in Sudan? How many hundreds of thousands of victims before we intervene? Rapid deployment has to be, otherwise the responsibility to protect becomes a fashionable slogan rather than a real empowerment of the United Nations and the regional systems that obtain. That is.
I think when the conceptual development took place of R2P, Francis Deng referred to the notion of the two sovereignties. First of all, sovereignty of a state externally within the international system, which implies that there's no intervention in each other's internal affairs. But there's also the sovereignty of a state, the sovereign, vis-à-vis its population. And in case R2P crimes are taking place, then that relationship has been broken. And I think the logic of R2P is that then that sovereignty is removed and it's no longer in effect. I think to speak legalese, R2P intervention, which is the very last, we have to be clear about that, the very last ultimate tool which can be used, which hopefully is the exception. In the original text, the text of the ISIS conference back in 1999, it was a lower threshold for this intervention. It was if a state is unable or unwilling to protect its population. In 2005, during the World Summit, there was a higher threshold that was agreed upon amongst heads of state and government, and that is when a state is manifestly failing to protect its population. But I think all this makes clear that, and you all know this, that first and foremost, R2P is not a legal tool. It kind of gathers existing legal requirements of states that have been in place since the Genocide Convention and afterwards in international humanitarian law. It is primarily a political tool, which is aimed at bolstering the political will of the Security Council and any country that is capable, that has the leverage to change something about the situation at an early level, at an early stage, to do something about it, rather than a legal tool. So,
Another question?
I just want to ask you, when did the responsibility to protect finish? Because in the case of Libya, we have seen that a new administration come to power and they have adopted certain measures against the members of the former government. So when the international community stop protecting those peoples, or we still have the responsibility to protect those who belong to the former government?
So the question is, what is the responsibility to protect after the initial intervention?
when does it finish? Is that what you refer to?
When does the responsibility to protect finish? For instance, in the case of Libya, the former government was overthrown and we have a new administration. So, but they are adopting certain measures against the members of the former government. So we are going to guarantee that they don't abuse of their political power or military.
Do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah, we can do that. Let's get a couple more, and then we can have them answer. Go ahead.
To what extent do you think that the invocation of R2P in Libya was a consideration at all in the international community's current, conscious decision not to invoke R2P in Syria? Do you think that is a consideration, or is it more what you were touching on with just the geopolitical and strategic situation of Syria? Is that basically the factor that has prevented R2P?
All right, let's take one last one.
It's the question for all three panelists. Do you think that there is a danger that responsibility to protect can become a tool in the big powers' hands, which they can use to protect their own interests? because I think it's striking to me that the intervention in Libya took place, after years of friendship between Gaddafi on one side and Western leaders on the other side. Yesterday I was reading some news, and then I found like a letter of Prince Charles to Gaddafi, or the correspondence between Gaddafi and Sarkozy, or correspondence between Gaddafi and Tony Blair, comparing with the situation in Syria, because now I'm reading in the news that today 70 people were killed. And then if there is no intervention in Syria, how can you compare? I mean, is there also a danger that responsibility to protect become a tool for the regime change in the hands of big powers? Thank you.
Who would like to start? Mr. Kraus?
Sure. When does it finish? It doesn't. Once again, responsibility to protect is not just an act of intervention. That's when everything else has failed. That's when everything else the wheels have fallen off and everything else has gone wrong, and a lot of people have not done their job. So even in the case of Libya, in a post-Gaddafi Libya, the responsibility to protect still rests upon the new transitional government and the governments in that region and the international community to be able to do their pieces within the three pillars of responsibility to protect. You will see, for example, one of the pieces invoked by the Security Council was a referral to the International Criminal Court, and you will see the prosecutor of the court looking not only at members of Gaddafi's regime, but also as members of the transitional government and forces, if they're acting out and taking actions that still put those four crimes out on the table. So I don't think there's no line drawn in the sand, because once again, it's a continuum that we're dealing with. So and typically, one of the reasons why it's important to be able to have good means of ending conflict is because if you don't end it properly, that's just the beginning of the next conflict. So there's this conflict cycle. So within the context of that cycle, there is always this responsibility to protect populations from these different crimes. Regarding, the relationship of the intervention in Syria to how the reaction in Libya, Libya to Syria, I think in some case there was a bit of buyer's remorse after Libya, and NATO, they went in, did the kind of intervention that they did on the part of some nations. And I think it's important to understand in Libya, you had the Arab League asking for action, the Gulf Coast states asking for action. You had the Libyan ambassador at this point who was asking for action. So there was a lot of pieces that lined up to make this happen. In Syria, you don't have that scenario at all, and it's just been more slowly developing now that the Arab League has taken its position. I think you'll see that this building towards more robust action at the Security Council if the intervention of the Arab League or individual states don't make a difference. And then, can it be a big power tool? Well, I suppose, any political tool within the international community can be something that big powers will utilize, but it's also something that I think one of the reasons you're seeing China and you're seeing Russia kind of back off a little bit more is they're concerned that the more this concept of the responsibility to protect, that you can't go around and shoot your demonstrators when they're saying things that you don't like. They're probably scratching their heads and saying, now wait a second, we have to do that sometimes. Do we want to really allow this norm to grow? So on one hand, yes, it can be a big power tool, but it also, I think, is something that could be limiting the actions of big powers and something that they're concerned about, which is why we want to push even harder to make it a norm that's accepted and adopted.
I saw one very interesting statement by the president of the Libyan National Council, Al-Gaddafi. He was asked why was Gaddafi executed, and he said it was not our intent, it was not our idea, it was a request from the Western diplomats. And he said, I assume that they didn't want him as a witness. That's what he said for Bloomberg.
Yeah, this is
It's really striking. I don't say that there shouldn't be a responsibility to protect. I mean, this is also, I think, one of the reasons why the United Nations exists. But on the other side, I'm a little bit suspicious in certain cases about the altruism as the main spirit of small.
Yeah, that's the first thing I've heard, that particular comment regarding Gaddafi. Our press release when that happened was that the Libyan people were really denied accountability when that happened.
I think that's all we have time for. I think there's a class coming in here soon, so please join me in giving our panelists another round of applause.